Good evening and welcome to my channel Centuries Untold, where we will travel together through centuries and we'll try to answer questions such as why, what, and how. So, viewers, today's video is going to be very interesting. This is a topic that I wanted to talk about for some time now, and finally, I decided to record a video on this topic. Like I said, the topic is very interesting. The topic for today's video is the history of Russia, Russian people. So I'm going to talk about Russia as a country as a whole, and I'm going to try. I'm going to try to explain the origin of this country, what we call Russia. Excuse me. Okay, and I want to make sure that I go over the details with you. So at the end of the video, you will have a better picture, better understanding of the origin of this country we call Russia and its people, okay? Where it started and how it evolved throughout the centuries and where it is today. Okay, so let's start. Viewers, before I start into the history of Russia, I do want to give you a little bit information on the group of people who make up mostly Russian people today, but also the other nations in Eastern Europe. Okay, they share a common ethnicity or common roots, background. Excuse me. And this term is called Slav, S-L-A-V, Slav. Okay, or sometimes when you refer to those people who live in those areas today, are called Slavic people, S-L-A-V-I-C, Slavic people. Okay, now these are the Slavic. So what is a Slavic? Who are Slavic people? Basically, these are the indigenous people who have been living in those lands, what we call today Eastern Europe. Most of, not all, but most of Eastern Europe, like Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, Belarus, Ukraine, Russia. Okay, that is where their concentration is. Now, so these are the people in ancient time, in older time, about over 1,000 years ago, they were divided into East, North, West Slavic people. Okay, so the modern day Russian people and modern day Serbia, Serbs, Croatia, Ukrainian people, Belarus, they all make up the same ethnic background, which is called Slav people. Okay, so that's what it is. Okay, so I just want to give you a little bit background on their background, the group of people. Now let's go to the origin of Russian people. Okay, so what is their origin? I mean, you may have heard a lot of stories about Russia, in the modern times. What Russia is, and a lot of you probably have understanding of Russia from the lenses of Cold War, USSR, right? And recently about, who the president, all those kind of stuff. But how many of you really know the origin of Russia, where it started altogether, where it emerged? Because my viewers, I will tell you this, you cannot understand, you will not be able to understand, especially if you're trying to resolve issues, right, problems. You will not be able to understand, be able to resolve, until you go to the root cause, where it started, and then move from bottom to top and try to resolve it from that angle. If you try to resolve certain issues just on the top and not taking care of the real reason, issues, causes, grievances, then you're not helping. You may be just putting a bandage, like a temporary bandage. That's it. Okay? So it's very important for you to understand the root causes, the behind, historically speaking, what happened. Okay? So that, trust me, that will really give you a very better, good understanding of the present day, maybe some present day issues, concerns, right? So let's travel back. So for us to understand the really history of Russia, you have to travel with me over 1,000 years back. Okay, so let's travel back. We are going to start our journey in 9th century, like in the middle of 800s, 850, 860 CE. Okay, so we are now going back there. So what happens in the middle of 9th century, around 850, 860? The area that time was recent settlement in that area. There was an area, I'm going to give you a name of it in 1 second, where there was a new settlement. There were a group of people, Slav people were living there. And that area, that small settlement was called Kyiv. How many have you heard this name Kyiv recently? Right. It is the modern day capital of Ukraine. Okay? Kyiv is located on the river bank. So that is where, there was a small settlement, and what happens, there was some disputes going on, internally speaking, to that area, that small principality. And they invited the duke or the king or the tribal leader, whatever you want to call him. He invited 3 grand princes from Scandinavia, from Vikings. They come, the story goes, they come in to the area which is called Kyiv. They come in and they, settle down their dispute. And then what happens? They end up staying there. They do not leave. So what is the lesson, little bit lesson there? So if you're going to invite somebody to settle down your disputes, issues, then that you're stuck with this person, basically, right? And then you just have to, live with that. So that's exactly what happened, historically speaking. Those 3 grand princes come, they settle down their disputes over there, and they end up, one of them actually ended there, living there, and he never leaves. And that's where the actual Russian people's history starts, basically. It's not Moscow, by the way. In 9th century, there was no name Moscow, okay? Moscow, nothing like that. It was a Kyiv, actually. So that's where the origin and the history of Russian people starts. And the name that eventually emerged to basically to identify Russian people was called Kyivian Rus. Kyivian, which is the capital of Ukraine today, Rus, R-U-S, Kyivian Rus, meaning the Russian people that time. Okay? So their origin is Kyiv, not Moscow. That's a very important point to remember. So what happens now? So there were multiple dynasties that ruled that principality, Kyiv, and surrounding areas that time. Okay. So, and their duration, the Kyivian Rus duration, different kingdom, is a 500-600 year long period from 860 to all the way to 1240. That is the duration. What we also known as during that time period is called Rurik dynasties, Rurik kingdoms, Rurik, R-U-R-I-K, Rurik, okay? So that is a time period that covers, which we call Kyivian Rus. That's where the beginning is. So I want you to understand this very important piece of information. The origin of Russian people did not start in Moscow or that area, which is today is known as Russia, right? It started in Kyiv, okay? That's the origin. The history of Russian people starts. So moving forward, what happens in the next century, the 10th century, around 980 something, there was a king over there, right? And he was actually, now by the way, even at that time in the 10th century, 980, 900, these people were still following their old pagan religion. They were not Christian that time. They were not have any other religion. They were still following their old religious traditions. Basically, that was a combination of Vikings, gods, things like that. Okay, so what happens, how they became Christian, that's a very interesting story. So I'm going to spend maybe 2 minutes on that quickly. So in 980, there was this king Basil who was ruling Ukraine, Kyiv principality at that time, around that area. And he was interested in learning about new faiths. So he was basically looking to convert him and his people. And so when he looked around the world that time, by the way, around in 980, the world at that time looked something like this. There was the Byzantine Empire, which had shrunk over the centuries, but it was still considered a Byzantine empire with its capital at Constantinople, right? And if you move further down in Eastern Mediterranean, and in Western Asia and North Africa and Spain, there was, under Islamic rule. There was Islamic countries over there, Muslim rule, right? So he knew that. So story goes that he one day invited the religious scholars of all three faiths, meaning Christian scholars, Muslim scholars, and Jewish scholars who were living in around Palestine, Lebanon, and scattered around within the Muslim empire. So he invites all three people in his court in Kyiv, and he engaged with them, tried to learn the faith of all three, and it is said that eventually he settled down on two: Christianity or Islam. So he was basically wrestling between those two. Okay. The Jewish faith, Judaism, he did not become too much interested in it, because at that time he felt, Judaism had no country or had no empire, had no conquests of its own. So it was basically Islamic world and the Christian side that he was really end up interested in. And then he finally chose Christianity. And there is also an interesting story about it, why he chose Christianity over Islam, because, as you know, in Islam, alcohol is not allowed, wine is not allowed. And then when he asked this question to both scholars on both sides, Christian and Islamics, that can I drink? Can we consume alcohol? The Christian scholars, of course, said yes, there's no problem. But Islamic scholars said no, you cannot consume. So I think maybe that was a deciding factor for him. But that's the story. That's how the story is written. Okay, so you can make your own judgment on that. But I think it was not just that. I think it was more like him and his court in Kyiv were more closer. Physically, they were close to Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. So they had a lot of contacts with them at the Byzantine court. So I think they were influenced by that. So I think maybe that played more role in his decision to adopt Christianity as compared to Islam. Okay. So anyway, that's the story. So moving forward now, what happened? So they were the Kyivian Rus expanded throughout these next few centuries until the middle of 13th century. Now, what happens in 13th century, around 1230, 1240, 1250, 1260? What happens? Can you guess? Yes, in that time, a bigger threat to the whole world, to whole civilized world came. Now, let me also define the civilized world in 13th century, 11th century, 10th century. So I don't want you to confuse with this word civilized world as we define today, as it is understood today, okay? Not from that perspective. you have to think about back then, 9th century, 8th century, 10th century, 11th century. So the civilized world viewers at that time were really considered two areas, three areas. Okay, the Chinese civilization was at its peak, was considered a civilized world, rightfully so. The Islamic world, the Muslim world, was definitely considered a very civilized world that time, rightfully so. And the third was Byzantine Empire at Constantinople. They were also considered a civilized part of the civilized world, rightfully so. Okay. Western Europe was not at that time at par from any sense of any word of definition at that point. Okay, England was like in 10th century, 11th century was still under Viking threat. Viking was still invading England as we know it. France was still wrestling with petty kingdoms within itself, and we know that Germanic tribes were still fighting each other. And Spain was the Islamic Spain at that time. It was under Muslim rule. So there was no such civilized world as a true sense of word in Western Europe at that time. And that's fact. Okay. So back to big and what happened? The biggest threat that came from east, like meaning from Mongols, Tatars. So as you know, the Mongols were a really menace to the world in 13th century under Genghis Khan. Mongols, you can see the map behind me that their empire at their peak. You can see how big the empire was. But by the time Genghis Khan died in 1227, and his sons and his grandsons expanded. So part of their Mongol conquest continued, and part of the conquest carried over by his son and one of his son and his grandsons on the northern part of northern Asia into Caucasus region, which is today's Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, into Black Sea area, and eventually into Eastern Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, and eventually they got to Kyiv. The sacked Kyiv. Around the whole area was totally destroyed by Mongols. So that happened around 1240, 1250. So that really basically disintegrated the Kyivian Rus kingdom. So the Russian people were scattered at that time, but because of the Mongols, right? Really, a lot of damage was caused. So that was pretty much the end of Kyivian Rus. Like I said, they disintegrated. So one of the princes really made its way into west and north of Kyiv, and formed a small principality over there. Okay, and that small principality was called Muscovy, which became Moscow today, and that is the beginning of Moscow. Muscovy. The Grand Prince moves to that area around the Volga River and formed a very small principality over there with some of his people. And that's how, if you look at the growth of Moscow from that point onward, it's like it started literally like a small dot, like this. This is Moscow. And over the centuries, it expanded. Okay, so that is the origin of Moscow. So Russian history at that point onward shifted from Kyiv toward Moscow, focused. And so what happens once that principality is established as Muscovy, Moscow, there were still other powerful principalities that were spared by the Mongol attacks. And one of the principality was further north and west. It's called Novgorod. Okay, very powerful principality at that time. If I say that was even more powerful than Muscovy and Kyiv, So that may not be totally untrue, okay? So our focus is on the Moscow now at this point, okay? 1300 and onward. One of the thing that one of the reason that this small state of Muscovy survived early days because it basically cooperated with Mongols, which they started to call them Tatars. Actually, it was Mongols, okay? And those people settled down, the Mongols settled down on the north of Caucasus, Black Sea, around that area, okay? So the early Muscovy princes, kings, they were not kings, they were Grand Duke, they were called. They started to cooperate with those Mongols, chieftains, kings, tribes. They were paying them tribute. So basically, Mongols left them alone. So I think this was not a bad policy at that time because, think about it. Small principality of Muscovy could not stand Mongols, right? The big lot of kingdoms fell. Muscovy had no chance. So they kind of cooperated with them, made a friendship with them to survive. And that's how they survived early. And by the time 15th century started, like 1400, Mongols themselves were weak. They were no longer a threat. They were no longer kind of, uh, uh, a menace to the people, to the rest of the world. They were too busy inside. So their great days were gone at that by the 1400 started. So let's move forward. So like I said, the state of Muscovy started to grow from this to big. By the end of 1400, Muscovy was really not just a strong state at that time, but it started to occupy other small principalities around it. And that's very natural, common phenomena throughout the history. One state gets a hold, and from there it starts to get bigger. Eventually, they start to swallow the other areas around it. You look at history, that's what you find out. So the one state emerged victorious. In this case, Moscow basically emerged victorious. And one of the credit goes to one of the credit that goes toward the growth of Moscow toward its wise grand dukes that came one after the other. One of this grand duke was called Ivan, and as you viewers, as you know, Ivan, Ivan, Ivan is a very common name, at least during that time in for Russian people. Okay, so this this grand duke becomes Ivan. His name was Ivan, Prince Ivan, and he becomes a Grand Duke around, I think, 1460, some around that time, okay, of Moscow. Now, this guy, this prince, the Grand Duke, Ivan, is a very important because why? For a few reasons. One, he finally decided that Russian people have enough of these Mongols, of these Tatars. And he felt strong enough to throw them out. Until that time, until his father's time, the state of Moscow was basically paying annual tribute to Tatars, to Mongols. But he decided that I am strong enough now that I'm not going to give these Mongols, Tatars anymore tribute. That's it, we are done. So obviously, how would he achieve that? Obviously, he had to fight. So one day, the Mongol Tatar envoy comes to Moscow and demand their annual tribute. Guess what Ivan did? He threw them out. He said, "No more tribute. Get out. We will not pay you any more tribute. Those days are done. Do whatever you want to do. So this was the clear message Ivan gave to Mongol, Tatar, and why. So they went back, and obviously there was a battle. There were a couple of battles in which, luckily for Ivan, he won. So Mongol, Tatar, basically influence in Russian culture, history was done. There is a saying in Russian tradition, and this particular events actually, where they actually got rid of Mongols, Tatar, is called Tatar yoke. You know what yoke mean? Yoke mean basically slavery, basically Tatar slavery, Tatar yoke. So they overthrow this slavery of Mongols, Tatars at that point. Okay, so finally, this, and the second thing that this guy Ivan did, he married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Sophia. Her name was Sophia. Okay, so he married her. So when he married her, basically he started to claim, this guy Ivan started to claim that he is now the new Rome. He is the new Constantinople. He is the new champion of, Byzantine, because he married the last Byzantine emperor's niece, Sophia, around 480-85. Okay. And after he threw out Mongol yoke, he's the first Grand Prince of Moscow, who started to call himself Tsar. Okay, so from 1500 onward, this Grand Prince, or Grand Duke, or Grand Duchy was basically replaced by this new word, Tsar. And you know what Tsar means in Russian language. And it's, by the way, it's spelled with Tsar. Okay, so what Tsar means in Russia? Tsar basically a Russian word meaning Caesar, the Roman Emperor Caesar. Right? So that's basically that equivalent word in Russian language is Tsar, basically Caesar. Okay, Julius Caesar, or Caesar, Roman Emperor. So that shows you what was the Russian rulers were thinking about that time, because they felt relieved. Oh, no longer we are under Mongols, Tatar slavery or yoke. They are gone. We beat them. We kicked them out. Right? So we are free now. So now we are going to expand more and more and more. And that's exactly what they did. And this guy, Ivan, also developed Moscow a lot. He added a lot of new buildings. So, Moscow started to take shape like a real city. Okay? Not some small principality. So Moscow started to take shape. Okay, so let's move forward. Okay? So, and this Ivan eventually in the Russian history is called Ivan the Great. Okay? Because what he did. Now, we're going to keep moving forward into Russian history. Now we are at the end of 15th century. So there is another Ivan comes to the throne. Okay. Now, this Ivan was very, very different from the previous Ivan. Okay. This Ivan in the history is called Ivan the Terrible. Why he's called Ivan the Terrible? Because he was very brutal. He kind of suppressed, executed a lot of people. Some people say that he was not thinking correctly in his mind. But regardless of that, he ruled Russia, Moscow at that time. Now, so by the way, the Russia word is now emerged, not just Moscow, okay? Because the previous Ivan the Great, by the end of his rule, he had added a lot of territory around Moscow, really tripling the size of the land. And Russia became a kingdom. He started to use this for Russia, kingdom, okay? So it's no longer small Moscow, it's now Russia. Because he tripled the size of the land around it. All these small principalities was absorbed. Okay, so Russia now has, by the 1500, has emerged as a kingdom, just like England, just like France, just like, By the way, what was going on in 1500 in the world? Can you guess? While Ivan the Terrible was dealing internally with other Russian dissidents people. Okay, in 1500, okay, just 10 years ago, 9 years ago, New World was discovered, right, by Columbus by Spain in 1492. In 1500, while Ivan the Terrible was dealing internally with Russian people, Ottoman Empire was its peak. If you look at Ottoman Empire during 1500, it was basically controlling, Eastern Mediterranean, most Eastern Europe at that time. Okay. In England had emerged by 1500 as a strong monarchy kingdom. The Tudors were ruling England at that time. So was in France. France has emerged as a strong kingdom. Okay? And in Spain, the Reconquista was completed at that time in 1500, and Ferdinand and Isabella was ruling Spain at that time. Okay? And if you go further east, there were still strong kingdoms in India and in China. Mughals had not emerged yet in India in 1500, but they will very soon. So this was the overall picture of the world, where Russian state was growing, and Ivan the Terrible was busy killing people right and left. Okay, he had to fight a few more wars. His biggest challenge was his nobles, just like any noble in any country, troublemakers. Okay, and in the Russia, those nobles were called boyars, boyers, boyars. Boyars mean duke, nobles, knights in Russian language. Okay, so he was dealing with them. By the time Ivan the Terrible died, Russia basically had become a kingdom and a consolidated country. Still expanding, not like they are still content with that, even though their size at that time was bigger than France, bigger than England, bigger than Spain. Okay, but they were still expanding. So what happens after the Ivan the Terrible's death? I'm just going to go over quickly. By the time he dies, no, by the way, it is also the time period of King Henry VIII in England, and later on his daughter Elizabeth, and also the Ottoman Emperor Solomon. Okay, so that time when he died, there was a period of unrest, 10-15 years in Russia. Few czars came and gone. But eventually, during the start of 17th century, 1600, there comes a family who was basically handpicked by those same boys, because there was literally drainage of the descendants of Ivan the Terrible at that time and his family. Okay, so the boys, there was a lot of chaos going on. And in Russian history, it's called a time of unrest during those 1590 and onward. Okay, so out of that anarchy, unrest, emerges a family which was handpicked by those nobles, Russian nobles and boyars. They went to this guy who was known, who was considered a direct descendant of not the Ivan the Terrible, not the Ivan the Great, directly by those Kievan Rus, the Ruriks dynasty, the one I started in the beginning. Okay? See the link? Not Ivan the Terrible, not Ivan the Great, not those families. This new prince, this new family who's going to rule Russia for the next 400 years has direct link with the Rurik dynasty families of Kievan Rus. Okay, So you can see the connection still going on, the origin of Russian people. Okay. So who was this prince that they chose, they picked? Okay. His name was Michael Romanov. Romanov. Okay. They offered him the throne in 1613. 1613. 1613. Russian throne, Russian crown was offered to him, which he accepted. So that's how a new dynasty, a new family, by the way, a final dynasty, a final family who ruled Russia and Russian people as czars. Romanov. And a lot of you probably have heard this family, Romanov. Okay, I'm going to tell you in a few minutes. So the crown was offered to this prince who belonged to this original Rurik family. Original, like I said before. Just same comparison you can make, viewers, when in the late 17th century, around early 18th century, like 1701, 1715, in England, when King William and Mary died, they had no child, so they offered the English crown to this prince, to this German prince, George I of Hanover. We will discuss the English history some other time. And they brought this German prince into England and offered him this crown because he was a Protestant. He was not Roman Catholic. So they offered him this throne. Similar pattern in 1613, the Russian nobles, offered the Russian crown and throne to this prince, Romanov. So anyway, so Romanov now started to rule Russia. Okay, and we move forward, and he ruled, for some time, make more expanded, little bit more kingdom. So Russia was keep growing. So keep that man, Russia was keep growing. Okay, but yet it had not emerged as a bigger power yet. It had not got in contact with the major powers of that region at that time, mainly the Western Europe at that time, who had merged strong at that time, by the way. And also on the southern side, the Ottoman Empire. So Russia had not yet contacted military-wise in conflict with these two groups, two sides. Not yet. It is coming. So we move forward. It comes the middle of the 17th century, and this Michael Romanov's descendants now literally ruling Russia. Okay. Now, what happened during the middle to the end of 17th century, like 1650 and onward? What happens basically? Another prince comes to the power. Okay. Keep in mind, like I said, Russia was still expanding. They were gaining more territories. Siberia was added. They got to the Siberia and other areas too, right in south. So during 1650s and 60s and 70s, there is a new prince comes to power. Now this prince was going to make a great, great, great impact on Russian people. Okay, just like 200 years before, like I said, Ivan the Great made an impact. Okay, so this new prince is also going to make a great impact on Russian society overall, maybe more. Can you guess this prince's name, who became the Tsar eventually in a very young age? His name was Peter, who is also known as Peter the Great. The Great because what he did for his country, for his people. Okay.